Close your eyes and imagine the world as it was, long before the hum of electricity, before the glow of streetlights, and before the artificial certainty of a temperature-controlled bedroom. As you settle into the soft, familiar comfort of your mattress, cocooned in woven fabrics and shielded by solid walls, allow your mind to drift backward through time. We are going to embark on a journey deep into the human past, traversing thousands, even millions of years, to understand how our earliest ancestors experienced the fundamental, inescapable biological necessity of sleep. The history of sleep is not just a history of rest, it is the history of our evolution, our survival, and the very development of the human mind. To understand how early humans slept is to understand how we became human in the first place. As the sun dips below the horizon in our modern world, we simply flip a switch to extend the day. But for the vast majority of our history, the setting sun was the undisputed conductor of human activity. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated darkness of a world without artificial light. Picture the immense, sweeping landscapes of the Pleistocene epoch, perhaps the vast, rolling savannas of Eastern Africa, where the cradle of humanity slowly rocked to the rhythm of the celestial spheres. As the relentless, scorching heat of the equatorial day began to wane, the sky would transform into a breathtaking canvas of deep bruised purples, fiery oranges, and fading golds. The shadows cast by the acacia trees would grow long and spindly, stretching across the dusty earth like dark fingers reaching for the coming night. The air, which had shimmered with heat mirages just hours before, would begin to cool rapidly, carrying the earthy, dry scent of the savanna grasses and the faint, ever-present musk of the wild world. For an early band of hominids, this transition from day to night was the most critical juncture of their existence. There was no ignoring the sunset. As the ambient light faded, their bodies, perfectly attuned to the natural rhythms of the earth, would begin a profound physiological shift. The drop in light levels registered directly on their retinas, sending an ancient, urgent signal to the pineal gland deep within the brain to release melatonin, the hormone of darkness and sleep. Their breathing would begin to slow, their core body temperature would drop infinitesimally, and a heavy, familiar weariness would settle into their bones after a long day of foraging, trekking, and walking across the endless plains. But this weariness was not something they could simply surrender to with the carefree abandon we enjoy today. In the primordial world, the night belonged to the predators. The ancient night was a soundscape of terrifying beauty. As the diurnal creatures settled into silence, the nocturnal hunters awakened. The distant, resonant roar of a saber-toothed cat or the bone-chilling whoop of a hyena pack would echo across the landscape, serving as a constant, visceral reminder that humans were not the apex predators of the dark. To sleep was to surrender consciousness, to render oneself entirely vulnerable to a world that saw early humans as prey. Because of this profound vulnerability, the act of sleeping required intricate planning, communal cooperation, and a deep understanding of the environment. Before we walked fully upright, before we mastered the flames that would eventually keep the darkness at bay, our earliest ancestors, the Australopithecines, sought refuge where they had always found it, high above the ground. Imagine the scene millions of years ago. As twilight descended, these small, agile hominids would climb into the canopy of large, sturdy trees. they would seek out thick horizontal branches or the sturdy forks where major limbs met the trunk. Here, they would painstakingly construct sleeping platforms, much like modern chimpanzees and orangutans do every single evening. They would bend and weave leafy branches together, creating a springy, bowl-shaped nest designed to cradle their bodies and prevent them from plummeting to the forest floor while unconscious. Sleeping in the trees offered safety from ground-dwelling predators, but it came at a significant evolutionary cost. Tree beds are inherently unstable. The wind sways the branches, the wood is hard and unforgiving, and a constant subconscious fear of falling dictates the quality of rest. Arboreal sleep is fragmented, light, and continuously interrupted. Our tree-dwelling ancestors could not safely enter the deepest stages of sleep, particularly the phase known as REM, or rapid eye movement sleep. During REM sleep, the brain becomes highly active, processing memories, solving problems, and engaging in vivid dreaming. But crucially, during REM sleep, the body undergoes a temporary muscle paralysis, a mechanism designed to stop us from acting out our dreams. If an Australopithecus experienced deep REM paralysis while balancing in a tree nest 50 feet above the ground, the slightest shift could lead to a fatal fall. Therefore, their sleep was an evolutionary compromise, safe from the jaws of the leopard, but deprived of the profound restorative depths of unconsciousness. The great leap forward in human history, the pivot upon which our entire neurological development turned, was the descent from the trees. As the climate shifted and the dense forests of Africa began to thin out, giving way to vast open grasslands, our ancestors, most notably Homo erectus, were forced to adapt to a terrestrial life. They began to walk upright, traversing greater distances across the savanna, and eventually they made the terrifying, revolutionary decision to sleep on the ground. This transition was not a simple change of address, it was a biological revolution. To sleep on the earth meant giving up the physical safety of the canopy. It meant sleeping at eye level with the apex predators of the Pleistocene. How did they survive? The answer lies in the most important technological breakthrough in human history, the mastery of fire. Picture a small band of Homo erectus gathering together as the last light bleeds from the sky. They have chosen their sleeping site carefully, perhaps a slight elevation that offers a vantage point, or a dry riverbed protected by a steep bank, or the shallow overhang of a cliff face. The earth is still warm from the day's sun. In the center of their gathering, a brilliant, flickering orange light pushes back the encroaching darkness. They have built a fire. The crackle and hiss of burning wood, the smell of wood smoke drifting into the cool night air, the dancing shadows cast upon the rugged faces of the tribe. This was the first true bedroom. Fire changed everything. It was a weapon made of light and heat, a terrifying element to the creatures that stalked the night. Predators instinctively feared the flames, and the perimeter of the firelight became a sanctuary, a magical circle of safety within which early humans could finally relax their vigilance. The fire provided warmth against the biting chill of the savanna night, allowing our ancestors to shed their thick body hair over evolutionary time, as they no longer needed it for insulation. But perhaps most importantly, the fire extended the day. For millions of years, hominids had gone to sleep when the sun went down and woken when it came up. The length of their sleep was dictated entirely by the seasons and the latitude. But with the invention of the hearth, Early humans created their own light. The hours between sunset and sleep were suddenly transformed. This was the birth of the evening. Around the glowing embers, the tribe would gather. They would repair their stone tools, share food, and eventually, as language began to evolve, they would share stories. The hearth became the focal point of human culture, the place where the bonds of community were forged and strengthened. It was here, staring into the mesmerizing, ever-changing geometry of the flames, that the human imagination truly began to take flight. With the safety of the fire established, early humans could finally achieve something their tree-dwelling ancestors could not: deep, uninterrupted, ground-level sleep. Freed from the fear of falling and protected by the flames and the presence of their kin, Homo erectus could safely enter prolonged periods of REM sleep. The muscle paralysis of deep dreaming was no longer a death sentence. It was a biological luxury. The consequences of this deep sleep were staggering. REM sleep is essential for cognitive development, memory consolidation, and emotional regulation. It is the time when the brain physically reorganizes itself, pruning unnecessary synaptic connections and strengthening important ones. By unlocking the ability to sleep deeply on the ground, early humans inadvertently unlocked the potential of their own minds. Some anthropologists argue that it was this sudden increase in high-quality, REM-rich sleep that provided the neurological foundation for the rapid expansion of the human brain. In a very real sense, we dreamt ourselves into humanity. But sleeping on the ground, even with a fire, was not simply a matter of lying down in the dirt. Early humans were resourceful and highly attuned to their physical comfort. They were the original mattress makers. Archaeological evidence, painstakingly uncovered from ancient rock shelters and caves in South Africa and beyond, gives us a fascinating glimpse into the construction of prehistoric beds. Imagine a group of hunter-gatherers preparing for the night in a spacious rock shelter tens of thousands of years ago. The stone floor is hard, cold, and damp. To sleep directly upon it would drain the body of its vital heat. So, they set about creating an insulating layer between themselves and the earth. They gather large, sweeping bundles of sedge grasses, reeds, and broad leaves from the surrounding environment. They are not merely piling these randomly, they are engineering a sleeping surface. They would lay down a thick foundational layer of sturdy, springy branches and thick-stemmed plants to create a cushion against the hard rock. Over this, they would weave softer grasses and broad leaves, creating a smooth, comfortable surface that contoured to the shape of the human body. These early beds were incredibly thick, sometimes up to a foot deep, providing excellent insulation and surprisingly luxurious comfort. The scent of the crushed green grasses, the rustle of the dry reeds beneath their bodies, the radiant warmth of the nearby hearth, these were the sensory inputs of the ancient night. But these prehistoric beds were more than just comfortable. They were marvels of ancient pharmacology. Early humans possessed a deep empirical knowledge of the local flora. They understood that the ground was home to a multitude of pests, ticks, fleas, lice, and mosquitoes that could make sleep miserable and transmit deadly diseases. To combat this, they intentionally incorporated specific plants into their bedding, specifically for their insect-repelling properties. In places like Sibudu Cave in South Africa, archaeologists have discovered the remains of sleeping mats dating back 77,000 years. Woven into these ancient mattresses were the leaves of the Cryptocarya woodii tree, a plant that, when crushed, releases a sharp aromatic scent, similar to modern camphor or eucalyptus. This scent is toxic to mosquitoes and other biting insects. By layering these fragrant medicinal leaves into their beds, early humans created a chemical shield around their sleeping bodies. Imagine the soothing, medicinal aroma rising from the mattress as they tossed and turned, a natural incense that kept the parasitic world at bay. They were using chemistry to ensure a good night's rest tens of thousands of years before the invention of synthetic repellents. Furthermore, they understood the concept of hygiene, at least in a practical sense. Beds made of organic material inevitably attract moisture, pests, and decay over time. Early humans did not simply sleep on the same rotting pile of vegetation year after year. When a bed became too old, too infested, or too compressed to offer comfort, they didn't just throw it away, they burned it. The ash left behind from these burned beds formed a clean, sterile, and highly alkaline base for the next mattress. Ash is a brilliant natural desiccant. It absorbs moisture and creates an environment so dry that ticks and mites cannot survive in it. The new bed would be built directly on top of the powdery gray ash of the old one, creating a continuous cycle of renewal and sanitation. As they lay down on these carefully constructed, aromatic, ash-lined beds, the structure of their sleep was remarkably different from ours. Today, we are conditioned to expect a single, unbroken block of 8 hours of unconsciousness. If we wake up at 3 a.m., we consider it a failure, a bout of insomnia, a problem to be solved with pills or anxiety. But for early humans, a single block of sleep was neither practical nor natural. Their sleep was likely highly flexible, opportunistic, and polyphasic. They slept when they were tired, and they slept when the environment demanded it. On a blazing hot afternoon on the savannah, when the sun was too punishing for hunting or foraging, they would seek the deep shade of an acacia tree or a rocky overhang and take a long, restorative nap. But the night sleep, the main period of rest, was the most complex. There is a well-regarded anthropological theory known as the sentinel hypothesis. It suggests that in a group of early humans, it was extremely rare for everyone to be asleep at the exact same time. The risk of predation was simply too high. Instead, their sleep cycles were naturally staggered. Just as a flock of birds or a herd of antelope always has a few individuals scanning the horizon for danger, a human tribe always had eyes open in the dark. This staggered sleep is deeply encoded in our genetics even today. Think of the natural variations in human sleep preferences. We have early birds who naturally wake up at the first light of dawn, and we have night owls who feel most alert late in the evening and struggle to rise early. In modern society, we often view these differences as personal quirks or even flaws, trying to force everyone into the same 9-to-5 schedule. But in the context of our evolutionary history, these diverse chronotypes were a survival strategy. The night owls of the Pleistocene tribe would stay awake late into the night, tending the fire, keeping watch, and listening to the sounds of the darkness, while the early birds entered deep sleep. By the time the night owls finally succumbed to exhaustion in the deep hours of the early morning, the early birds were already stirring, naturally waking up to take over the watch as the sky began to lighten. Because of this genetic variation in circadian rhythms, there was almost always someone awake, or at least in a very light, easily rousable state of sleep. The tribe acted as a collective organism, maintaining a continuous, vigilant consciousness even as individual members rested deeply. As the night progressed, the fire would burn down to a bed of glowing red embers, pulsing like a heartbeat in the dark. The sounds of the wild would continue, the rustle of wind through dry grass, the distant snap of a twig, the haunting call of a nightjar. For the sentinels sitting awake, the night was a time of intense listening, a time when hearing became far more important than sight. They would sit wrapped in animal skins, if the climate demanded it, staring out beyond the perimeter of the light, their minds active, interpreting every sound. And for those who were asleep, what did they experience? They dreamed just as we do, but their dreams were populated by the raw, immediate elements of their existence. They dreamt of the hunt, of the animals they revered and feared, of the spirits they believed inhabited the trees, the rocks, and the storms. The dream world was not viewed as a mere neurological byproduct, a random firing of synapses as we often see it today. For early humans, the dream world was a parallel reality, a profound and sacred space. In sleep, the boundaries between the physical world and the spiritual world dissolved. When an elder dreamed of a deceased ancestor, it was not just a memory, it was a visitation. When a hunter dreamed of a valley teeming with game, it was a vision, a prophecy to be followed the next day. The landscape of their dreams was an extension of the physical landscape they traversed while awake, but imbued with meaning, magic, and guidance. The shamans and spiritual leaders of the tribe were often those who could navigate this dreamscape most effectively, bringing back wisdom from the dark hours to guide the tribe in the light. This profound connection to the dream world was deeply woven into the physical reality of how they slept, not as isolated individuals in separate rooms, but as a tightly knit, breathing, murmuring collective. If you were to look down upon a sleeping band of hunter-gatherers, you would not see a neat row of solitary figures. You would see a tangled, overlapping mass of humanity. They slept in what anthropologists sometimes refer to as a puppy pile, a dense cluster of bodies pressed closely together. This extreme physical proximity was not a matter of a lack of space. It was a fundamental survival strategy and a profound source of psychological comfort. In our modern era, we highly value our personal sleeping space. We buy king-sized beds to ensure we do not bump into our partners, and we give our children their own bedrooms as soon as possible. But for early humans, isolation in the dark was synonymous with death. To be separated from the group at night was to be completely defenseless. Therefore, the touch of another human body was the ultimate reassurance. As they settled down onto their woven mats of grass and ash, they would huddle together, skin against skin, back to chest, limbs draped over one another. This collective sleeping arrangement served a brilliant thermoregulatory purpose. The nights on the savanna, and certainly the nights during the brutal cold of the Pleistocene ice ages, could be lethally frigid. Human bodies are excellent generators of heat. By clustering together, pooling their collective body heat beneath shared coverings of woven fibers, or later thick animal pelts, they created a warm, life-sustaining microclimate. The person in the center of the pile was the warmest, a position often reserved for the most vulnerable members of the tribe, the young children, the sick, and the elders. The stronger, more robust adults would take the outer edges, bearing the brunt of the cold air and acting as a physical buffer against the wild. But the benefits of this co-sleeping went far beyond mere temperature control. The constant, rhythmic physical contact had a profound neurological effect. When humans engage in prolonged physical touch, the brain releases a flood of oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone or the love hormone. Oxytocin acts as a powerful natural tranquilizer. It lowers heart rates, reduces blood pressure, and drastically suppresses the release of cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone. In a world fraught with the constant, terrifying threat of predation and starvation, the simple act of holding on to one another in the dark was a vital mechanism for soothing the nervous system. The collective breathing of the tribe, the synchronized rise and fall of dozens of chests, the comforting, familiar scent of their kin, all of this created an overwhelming sense of safety that allowed their hypervigilant minds to finally let go and sink into sleep. Within this tangled web of sleeping bodies, the experience of infancy was radically different from what we know today. There were no cribs, no separate nurseries, no baby monitors, and certainly no concept of sleep training or leaving a child to cry it out. A crying infant in the prehistoric night was a siren call to every predator within miles. Silence was survival. Therefore, human babies were in constant physical contact with their mothers or other caregivers 24 hours a day. When the mother lay down to sleep, the infant slept nestled securely in the crook of her arm or resting directly upon her chest. The baby's sleep architecture was intimately synchronized with the mother's. Because human milk is relatively low in fat and protein compared to other mammals, human infants need to feed very frequently. Throughout the night, the baby would wake, nurse quietly in the dark without fully rousing the mother from her resting state, and drift back to sleep. This continuous cycle of light sleep, feeding, and maternal warmth meant that neither mother nor child achieved the long, unbroken blocks of deep sleep we expect today. Instead, they shared a fluid, dynamic rhythm of rest that kept the baby fed, warm, and entirely silent. The mother's body was the infant's entire universe, providing the temperature regulation, the nourishment, and the profound immunological protection that ensured the child's survival through the perilous dark hours. As the millennia rolled on and the climate of the earth underwent massive, slow-motion upheavals, human sleeping habits had to adapt to increasingly extreme conditions. As populations migrated out of the African cradle and moved north into Europe and Asia, they encountered the brutal, unforgiving reality of the Ice Age. The night was no longer just a time of darkness and predators. It was a time of lethal, freezing cold. The ambient temperature could plummet to levels that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The open-air hearths of the savannah were no longer sufficient. Early humans, such as the Neanderthals and later Homo sapiens, were forced to seek shelter in the deep, sheltering moors of caves and rock overhangs. Stepping into one of these ancient caves as night fell was like entering the womb of the earth. The temperature inside the deep caves remained relatively constant year-round, insulated from the howling blizzards and plunging temperatures outside. But caves are inherently damp, rocky, and profoundly dark. To survive the Ice Age night, early humans became master tailors and engineers of insulation. This was the era of the megafauna, the woolly mammoths, the cave bears, the giant sloths. When these massive beasts were hunted, nothing was wasted. The thick, shaggy hides, lined with dense underfur and heavy layers of fat, became the most prized possessions a tribe could own. These were not just clothing, they were the ultimate prehistoric bedding. Imagine the scene deep within a limestone cavern in Ice Age Europe. A massive fire roars near the cave entrance, serving a dual purpose. It acts as a fiery barricade against cave lions and dire wolves, and it throws precious heat into the cavern's interior. Further back in the gloom, away from the drafts, the tribe prepares for sleep. They have laid down thick mats of dried moss, pine needles, and scrub brush to insulate themselves from the freezing stone floor. Over this, they spread the colossal, heavy pelts of mammoths and bears. When they climbed beneath these immense furs, they were essentially creating highly efficient sleeping bags. The thick fur trapped the warm air generated by their closely packed bodies, while the dense leather acted as an impenetrable windbreaker against any drafts whispering through the cave tunnels. It is a testament to human resilience that beneath the shadow of glaciers, enveloped in the skins of giants, our ancestors found the warmth necessary to dream. The concept of the three-dog night, a night so incredibly cold that a person needs to sleep with 3 dogs to keep from freezing to death, likely has its roots in this deep ancestral memory of relying on animal warmth and animal skins to survive the dark. And speaking of dogs, it was during this vast icy epoch that a profound shift occurred in the nocturnal world, a shift that would forever change the way humans slept. We invited a predator into the firelight. The domestication of the wolf into the domestic dog was one of the most critical turning points in human history, and its impact on human sleep cannot be overstated. Initially, the boldest wolves may have scavenged around the edges of human camps. Over generations, an alliance was forged. Humans provided scraps of food and the warmth of the fire. The wolves provided their unparalleled senses. As these animals evolved into early dogs, they became fully integrated into the human sleeping arrangement. When the tribe settled down for the night, the dogs did not sleep outside in the cold. They slept interwoven with the human bodies. Their body temperatures run slightly higher than ours, making them living, breathing hot water bottles in the freezing cave. But their most vital contribution was not warmth. It was their hearing and their sense of smell. Dogs possess sensory capabilities that vastly outstrip our own. They can hear the stealthy approach of a predator long before a human ear registers a sound, and they can smell the musk of a cave bear on the wind from miles away. By bringing dogs into the sleeping circle, humans essentially outsourced their nocturnal vigilance. The ancient biological need for the sentinel, the staggered sleep cycles where someone was always awake and listening, was suddenly alleviated. If danger approached, the dogs would hear it. They would growl, they would bark, they would raise the alarm long before the threat breached the firelight. For the first time in millions of years, the entire human tribe could let down their guard simultaneously. The presence of the sleeping dog at their feet allowed early humans to sink into deeper, more restorative, and more unified periods of sleep. We gave the dog a place by the fire, and in return, the dog gave us the gift of true rest. This deep symbiosis with animals and nature defined human sleep for hundreds of thousands of years. But then, approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, a seismic shift occurred in the human story. A shift so profound that it permanently altered our relationship with the earth, the sky, and the night. This was the Neolithic Revolution, the dawn of agriculture. Slowly, gradually, groups of humans stopped following the migrating herds. They discovered that if they planted the seeds of wild grasses, wheat, barley, rye, they could harvest the grain. They discovered that if they penned wild sheep, goats, and cattle, they had a constant supply of meat, milk, and wool. To tend these crops and flocks, they had to stay in one place. They had to put down roots, and so they began to build permanent structures. They built houses. The invention of the house changed the psychology of sleep forever. Before the house, humanity slept under the vast, open dome of the sky, or within the natural, pre-existing shelters of the earth. But when a human being mixed mud and straw to make a brick, stacked those bricks to make a wall, and laid timber and thatch across the top to make a roof, they did something revolutionary. They enclosed space. They created an inside and an outside. Imagine standing inside one of the very first mud brick dwellings in the ancient Levant or Mesopotamia as the sun sets. The door, perhaps made of woven reeds or a heavy animal skin, is pulled shut. The immense, sprawling wilderness, the wind, the stars, the predators, the unpredictable chaos of nature is suddenly locked out. Inside these thick, earthen walls, the air is still. The sounds of the wild are muffled. The temperature is regulated not just by a fire, but by the thermal mass of the building itself, which absorbs the heat of the day and slowly releases it throughout the night. For the first time, humans were sleeping in a manufactured environment. This was the birth of the bedroom, though it looked nothing like ours today. The first houses were typically single, open rooms where all of life took place. The hearth was no longer an open bonfire under the stars. It was moved indoors, often situated in the center of the room beneath a small smoke hole in the roof. The sleeping arrangements within these early houses also evolved. Because the earthen floor of a mud brick house could be damp, cold, and attractive to scuttling insects and rodents, people began to elevate their beds. In many Neolithic settlements, archaeologists have unearthed raised sleeping platforms built directly into the architecture of the house. These platforms, made of packed clay or stone and covered with plaster, were raised a few feet off the floor. On top of these platforms, the sleeping mats became far more sophisticated. The agricultural revolution brought not only food but also cultivated fibers. Flax was grown and painstakingly processed, spun into thread and woven into linen. Sheep were bred for their coats, giving rise to early woolen blankets. Imagine the profound sensory shift. After millions of years of sleeping on rough branches, crushed leaves, and heavy, sometimes rank-smelling animal hides, a human being could now lie down on a smooth, woven linen sheet. The feeling of crafted textiles against the skin, offering a breathable, lightweight layer of warmth and protection, was a monumental luxury. The soundscape of the night within these early agricultural villages was also entirely new. The terrifying roars of wild predators were largely a thing of the past, replaced by the domestic sounds of the settlement. As you lay in your mud brick house, you would hear the bleating of goats penned in the courtyard, the lowing of cattle, the barking of the village dogs, and the rhythmic, collective breathing of your family sleeping on the platform beside you. The night had been tamed, domesticized, brought to heel just like the crops in the field. But this newfound security brought with it a complex new set of anxieties. When humans lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers, they owned very little. Their wealth was their knowledge and their community. But with the advent of farming, humans began to accumulate surplus. They had granaries full of grain, pens full of valuable livestock, and houses full of tools, textiles, and eventually pottery and metals. For the first time in history, humans had property worth stealing. The walls that kept the lions out also served a darker purpose, keeping other humans out. The ancient fear of being eaten in the night was slowly replaced by a new, uniquely human fear, the fear of the raid. The night became the cover of darkness for thieves, rival villages, and marauding bands. The architecture of sleep adapted to this new paranoia. Settlements were surrounded by deep ditches and high palisade walls. The simple reed doorways of early huts were replaced by heavy wooden doors with rudimentary locking mechanisms, wooden bars dropped into stone brackets. When a Neolithic farmer barred his door at night, he was locking away his family and his wealth from the avarice of his fellow man. The psychological burden of sleep shifted. You were no longer just a biological organism seeking rest, you were an owner guarding your possessions. The sentinel was no longer just listening for the snap of a twig beneath a panther's paw. They were listening for the stealthy footsteps of a human intruder. Furthermore, as society became more complex and settled, the human imagination, freed from the immediate, pressing terror of wild animals, began to populate the darkness with new, invisible threats. The physical night was safer, but the psychological night grew darker. This is the era where the rich tapestries of nocturnal mythology truly begin to flourish. Without the light pollution of modern cities, the night sky over an ancient agricultural village was a dome of staggering, terrifying brilliance. The Milky Way was a bright physical presence. The phases of the moon dictated the calendar, and shooting stars or eclipses were viewed as profound, often ominous omens. The darkness inside the house, impenetrable once the hearth fire died down to embers, became a canvas for the human mind to project its deepest anxieties. If illness struck a child in the night, it was not a virus, it was a malicious spirit that had slipped through the cracks in the mud brick. If the milk soured or the sheep died, it was the work of a night demon. Across early civilizations, from the Lilith of ancient Mesopotamia, a female demon believed to roam the night stealing infants, to the restless ghosts of ancestors demanding appeasement, the night became a realm governed by the supernatural. Sleep itself was viewed as a deeply mysterious, borderland state, dangerously close to death. In many ancient cultures, it was believed that the soul actually left the body during sleep to wander the earth or visit the realm of the gods. To wake someone abruptly was considered highly dangerous, as their soul might not have time to return, leaving them lifeless or mad. Prayers, incantations, and protective amulets became a standard part of the bedtime routine. A farmer in ancient Sumer might bury a small clay figurine of a protective deity beneath the threshold of his bedroom door to ward off night terrors and demons before finally blowing out the oil lamp and surrendering to the dark. As humanity moved out of the scattered agricultural villages and began to build the first great empires along the fertile banks of the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Nile, the nature of sleep underwent another dramatic transformation. It was in these cradle civilizations of antiquity that sleep first became entangled with social hierarchy. For the vast majority of human history, sleep had been the great equalizer. Whether you were the best hunter in the tribe or the weakest elder, you slept on the same ground, beside the same fire, under the same stars. But as societies became stratified, divided into kings, priests, merchants, and laborers, the way a person slept became a stark, visible indicator of their status. Nowhere was this more evident than in ancient Egypt. If you were a common farmer laboring in the inundation plains of the Nile, your nights were humble. You likely slept on the flat roof of your mud brick house to catch the cool evening breezes that swept off the river, escaping the stifling, baked-in heat of the interior rooms. Your bed was a simple woven mat of palm fronds laid directly on the plaster roof, perhaps with a coarse linen sheet to pull over yourself as the desert air chilled in the early hours of the morning. But if you were a pharaoh, a high priest, or a wealthy noble, your sleep was an affair of staggering luxury and complex ritual. The ancient Egyptians elevated the bed from a mere sleeping platform into a masterpiece of art and engineering. If you were to walk into the bedchamber of a wealthy Egyptian noble, the first thing you would notice is that the bed was not flat. It was built with a distinctive downward slope, angling from the head down to the feet. To prevent the sleeper from sliding off during the night, a beautifully carved wooden footboard was attached to the bottom. The frames of these aristocratic beds were crafted from imported cedar or ebony, woods that were incredibly precious in the arid landscape of Egypt. They were supported not by simple posts, but by legs carved to resemble the powerful limbs of bulls or lions. This was not mere decoration, it was sympathetic magic. By sleeping on a bed supported by the legs of a fierce beast, the sleeper hoped to absorb the animal's strength and vitality while they rested, and to be protected by its spirit from the demons of the dark. Yet the most startling feature of the ancient Egyptian bed to our modern eyes was not the frame, but the pillow. They did not use soft, yielding cushions of feathers or wool. Instead, they used a rigid, curved piece of wood, stone, or ivory known as a headrest. Imagine lying down after a long day and resting the base of your skull on a hard, polished crescent of stone. It sounds agonizingly uncomfortable, but it served a highly practical, culturally specific purpose. The climate of Egypt was punishingly hot, and a soft pillow would absorb sweat, breed bacteria, and become intolerably warm. The wooden headrest elevated the head, allowing the cool night air to circulate freely around the neck and face. Furthermore, elaborate, painstakingly styled wigs and natural hairstyles were a crucial symbol of status in Egyptian society. The headrest acted to preserve these complex coiffures throughout the night, ensuring the noble awoke looking immaculate. But perhaps most importantly, in a land teeming with scorpions, centipedes, and venomous snakes, elevating the head off the mattress was a final line of defense against a lethal bite in the dark. These headrests were deeply personal items, often inscribed with the owner's name and spells of protection. The Egyptians believed that the head was the seat of life and the spiritual center of the body. During sleep, when the soul was taught to wander, the head was particularly vulnerable to possession by restless spirits or nightmares. By resting their neck upon a base carved with images of Bes, the fierce dwarf-like god who was the protector of the household and the sleeper, they built a magical fortress around their dreaming minds. As the centuries bled into millennia and the axis of power shifted across the Mediterranean, the Greeks and later the Romans refined the concept of the bedchamber, integrating it deeply into their social and domestic lives. In ancient Rome, the bed was the single most important piece of furniture in the house. It was known as the lectus, and it was remarkably versatile. The Romans did not confine their beds to a dark room reserved strictly for nighttime unconsciousness. The lectus was a place of living as much as a place of resting. There was the lectus cubicularis, the bed meant for sleeping, situated in the cubiculum, a small, often windowless room designed specifically to block out the noise and light of the bustling Roman streets. But there was also the lectus tricliniaris, the dining couch. The Romans famously ate their meals while reclining, leaning on their left elbows and reaching for olives, bread, and wine with their right hands. The bed was a place to entertain guests, to read, to write letters, and to conduct business. The boundaries between waking life and the furniture of sleep were wonderfully blurred. For the wealthy patrician class of Rome, the cubiculum was a carefully curated sanctuary. The walls were not bare stone. They were painted with incredibly vibrant, intricate frescoes depicting serene gardens, mythological scenes, or calming geometric patterns. Even with the wooden shutters pulled tight against the night, the glow of a small bronze oil lamp would illuminate these scenes, giving the sleeper beautiful imagery to drift away to. Their mattresses were a far cry from the straw and leaves of their ancestors. They were stuffed with soft wool, or, for the exceptionally wealthy, the down feathers of geese and swans. They slept beneath blankets of finely woven wool and sheets of imported linen or even silk brought across the vast, perilous trade routes from the east. However, beyond the thick, plastered walls of the patrician villas, the sleep of the Roman plebeians, the working class, and the massive enslaved population was a completely different reality. Rome was a loud, chaotic, and crowded metropolis. It was a city of stone and narrow streets, echoing with the clatter of iron-rimmed cartwheels, the shouts of vendors, and the general cacophony of 1 million people living shoulder to shoulder. Because traffic regulations often banned heavy carts during the daylight hours to prevent gridlock, the night was the time for hauling goods. For the poor, living in multi-story, poorly constructed apartment buildings, known as insulae, the night was a continuous, rattling din. Their beds were little more than wooden pallets stuffed with cheap straw or reeds, crawling with bedbugs and fleas, crammed into small, suffocatingly hot rooms shared by entire families. For them, sleep was not a curated luxury, it was a desperate, exhausted collapse amidst the roar of the empire. When the Roman Empire fractured and fell, giving way to the era we now call the Middle Ages, the architecture of sleep shifted once again, reflecting a world that had become more localized, more rural, and in many ways more dangerous. The great sprawling villas of antiquity were replaced by fortified manor houses and castles. In these cold, imposing stone structures, the concept of a private, isolated bedroom largely vanished. Society returned to a more communal, pack-like way of sleeping, driven by the absolute necessity of shared warmth and security. If you were to step into the great hall of a medieval castle or manor house after the evening meal, you would witness a scene of chaotic communal slumber. The great hall was the pulsing heart of the estate, a massive cavernous room with a high timber roof and a gigantic roaring fireplace at one end. Once the long wooden dining tables were dismantled and cleared away, the floor of the hall became the communal bedroom for the lord's entire retinue, knights, squires, servants, and travelers alike. They would lay down rough pallets stuffed with straw that was often mixed with sweet-smelling herbs like lavender or chamomile to mask the overpowering stench of unwashed bodies, wood smoke, and the damp dogs that slept among them. People slept fully clothed, wrapped in thick woolen cloaks, huddling together against the biting chill that seeped through the thick stone walls. There was absolutely no expectation of privacy. You fell asleep to the sound of 100 people snoring, muttering in their dreams, coughing, and shifting in the dark. Only the lord and lady of the manor were afforded a degree of separation. They slept at the far end of the hall, often on a raised wooden dais that physically elevated them above the sleeping masses on the floor below. Eventually, as architecture evolved, the lord and lady retreated to a separate room called the solar, situated above the great hall to catch the rising heat from the central fire. It was in these medieval solars that one of the most iconic pieces of sleep furniture was born, the four-poster bed. Today, we view the four-poster canopy bed as a romantic, decorative antique. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, it was a vital piece of survival technology. Castles and manor houses were incredibly drafty. The windows were often unglazed, covered only by wooden shutters or oiled parchment, allowing the freezing winter winds to whistle through the corridors. Furthermore, the roofs of many lesser manors and the houses of the lower classes were made of thatch, bundles of dried reeds or straw. While thatch provided good insulation, it was also a haven for mice, rats, spiders, and birds. The four-poster bed was designed to solve both of these problems. It was essentially a room within a room. The heavy wooden frame supported a canopy, known as a tester, which acted as a solid roof over the sleepers, preventing rat droppings, dust, or spiders from falling onto their faces in the middle of the night. But the true genius of the bed lay in its curtains. Thick, heavy tapestries or dense woolen drapes were hung from all four sides of the frame. When the lord and lady climbed into bed, their servants would pull these heavy curtains tightly shut, overlapping the edges to seal the interior. Inside this fabric box, a miraculous microclimate was created. The body heat of the sleepers, trapped by the thick curtains and insulated by heavy woolen blankets, warmed the small enclosed space, holding back the damp, bone-chilling cold of the stone room outside. When you pulled the curtains of a medieval bed shut, you were locking out the winter, creating a tiny, warm, incredibly private sanctuary in the midst of a harsh and unforgiving world. Within these curtained beds, and indeed across the straw pallets of the peasantry, the actual rhythm and timing of sleep during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance was vastly different from our own. Perhaps the most shocking revelation of historical sleep research is the discovery that for centuries humans did not sleep in one single unbroken 8-hour stretch. They practiced what historians and sleep scientists call biphasic or segmented sleep. Before the widespread adoption of artificial lighting, the long, dark nights of winter meant that people were confined to their beds for up to 12 or 14 hours. The human body does not naturally require 14 hours of sleep. As a result, the night was split into two distinct halves. As dusk fell and the candles or rushlights were extinguished to save money, people would go to bed. They would quickly fall into a deep, heavy unconsciousness. This was known as the first sleep or the dead sleep. It was a profound, restorative slumber that lasted for roughly 4 hours. Then, usually around midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, something fascinating happened. People woke up. This was not a restless, anxious waking like modern insomnia. It was a completely natural, expected, and peaceful stirring. For a period of 1 to 2 hours, in the absolute dead of night, the entire house, the entire village, the entire city was awake. This period between the first and second sleep was a unique liminal space in human history, a watch of the night that we have entirely lost. Imagine waking up in the pitch black of a 16th century winter night. The fire has burned down to a dull red glow in the hearth. The house is completely quiet, save for the wind outside and the rhythmic breathing of your family members who are also awake. What did people do during this midnight hour? The answer is almost everything. Because the darkness was so profound, activities were naturally limited. But it was a time of immense social and personal intimacy. People would simply lie in bed, wrapped in the warmth of their blankets, and talk. In an era before constant entertainment and distraction, this hour of the night was the prime time for deep conversation between spouses. It was a time to discuss the events of the day, to plan for the future, to share secrets in the dark. For many, it was the perfect time for sex. The first sleep had rested their tired, laboring bodies, and the house was quiet and still. Medical manuals from the 16th century actually advised couples that the best time to conceive a child was after their first sleep, when the body was refreshed but the mind was still relaxed and unburdened by the worries of the day. If they did not stay in bed, people might rise and tend to the fire, adding a fresh log to keep the chill at bay. They might perform simple, quiet chores by the dim light of the embers, spinning a bit of wool, mending a torn tunic, or preparing the tools for the next day's labor. In religious households, this hour was dedicated to prayer. Monks and nuns were explicitly required to rise in the middle of the night to sing the matins, but ordinary lay people also used this quiet, solitary time to pray, believing that the silence of the night brought them closer to God. Some people would even leave their beds entirely. They might step out of their homes, the crunch of snow or the squelch of mud under their boots, to check on their livestock in the barn. They might brew a weak ale or smoke a pipe of tobacco. Neighbors might even visit one another, slipping quietly through the dark streets to share a drink and a conversation by the hearth fire before the second sleep claimed them. This waking hour was also a time of profound introspection and creativity. Without the sensory overload of daylight, the mind was free to wander. It was a time when dreams from the first sleep were still fresh in the memory, easily recalled and analyzed. Poets wrote their best verses in this silent watch. Philosophers unspooled their deepest thoughts. It was a naturally meditative state, a pause button pressed in the very center of existence, a time when the veil between the conscious mind and the subconscious was remarkably thin. After this hour or two of gentle, low-stakes wakefulness, a natural drowsiness would return. People would settle back into their beds, pull the covers tight, and drift off into the second sleep or morning sleep. This sleep was often lighter, richer in REM sleep and vivid dreaming, lasting until the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the shutters or the crowing of the village rooster announced the day. This biphasic sleep pattern was not an anomaly. It was the standard way humans experienced the night for centuries, perhaps even millennia. It is referenced casually in the literature of the time, from the Canterbury Tales to the plays of Shakespeare to the diaries of ordinary farmers. It was simply the way the world worked. You slept, you woke, you lived a little in the dark, and you slept again. It was a rhythm beautifully attuned to the natural cycle of light and darkness, a rhythm that allowed the human mind a necessary period of quiet reflection in the heart of the night. But this ancient, deeply ingrained biological rhythm was on borrowed time. As the 17th and 18th centuries approached, a slow, creeping revolution began to fundamentally alter the human relationship with the dark. The cities were growing larger, denser, and wealthier. The narrow, winding medieval streets were beginning to give way to broader avenues and brick-built townhouses. And slowly, humanity was learning how to conquer the shadows. The first blow to the ancient night came in the form of street lighting. For most of history, stepping into the street after sunset without a lantern was a fool's errand. The night streets were pitch black, dangerous, and legally suspicious. Anyone found wandering after curfew without a light was assumed to be a thief or a scoundrel. But in the late 1600s, cities like Paris and London began to mandate the hanging of lanterns outside houses. Soon, municipal authorities took over, erecting thousands of oil lamps along the major thoroughfares. This introduction of street lighting changed the entire culture of the city. Suddenly, the night was no longer a realm of fear and confinement. It became an extension of the day. A new concept was born: nightlife. Taverns, coffee houses, and theaters could stay open later. People could socialize, conduct business, and stroll the streets long after the sun went down. Simultaneously, the technology of indoor lighting improved. While the poor still relied on smoky, foul-smelling tallow candles made from animal fat, the wealthy began to use spermaceti candles, made from the head matter of sperm whales, which burned with a bright, clean, odor-free flame. Later came the argand lamp, which produced a light 10 times brighter than a standard candle. As light became more abundant and more affordable, the boundaries of the day were stretched outward. Wealthy, fashionable people began to stay up later and later. Going to bed at sunset was suddenly viewed as rustic, unsophisticated, something only uneducated peasants did. To be modern, to be civilized, meant to conquer the night. This social shift had a devastating effect on the biphasic sleep pattern. As people pushed their bedtimes later into the evening, the long, dark hours required for segmented sleep were compressed. If you went to bed at midnight instead of 8 o'clock, you simply didn't have time to wake up for 2 hours in the middle of the night and still get enough rest before dawn. The first sleep and the second sleep began to merge together into a single consolidated block of unconsciousness. The waking hour in the middle of the night, once a time of prayer, intimacy, and reflection, was slowly erased from human experience. By the late 19th century, with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, this ancient rhythm would be almost entirely forgotten, replaced by the rigid, mechanical tyranny of the factory clock and the relentless glare of the incandescent light bulb. But before we reach the blinding light of the modern era, we must look closer at the bizarre, fascinating, and sometimes terrifying beliefs that surrounded sleep in the centuries preceding it. The era stretching from the late Middle Ages into the early modern period was a time of intense superstition, where the physical reality of the bedchamber was deeply entwined with the supernatural. As we linger in this era of transition, before the machines forever altered the rhythm of human rest, we must acknowledge the terrors that stalked the early modern mind in the dark. For centuries, the medical understanding of sleep was inextricably linked with the supernatural and the imbalance of the bodily humors. When a person experienced what we now easily diagnose as sleep paralysis, a terrifying but harmless glitch in the brain's sleep cycle, where the mind wakes up before the body's REM paralysis has worn off, they did not see a neurological hiccup. They experienced a visceral, demonic assault. Imagine waking in the dead of a 17th century night. The room is pitch black. You try to sit up, but your limbs are entirely unresponsive. You cannot move a finger, you cannot speak, you cannot scream. And then a crushing weight settles upon your chest, making every breath an agonizing struggle. In the shadows at the foot of your bed, your panicked, half-dreaming mind hallucinates a dark, malevolent figure. For the people of this era, this was not a dream. This was the incubus, a literal demon that had crawled into their bedchamber to steal their breath and their soul. The word nightmare itself stems from this exact belief. A mare or mare in Old English mythology was a goblin or evil spirit that rode upon the chests of sleeping people, suffocating them and bringing terrifying visions. To combat these nocturnal horrors, the bedchamber became a fortress of superstition. People would hang iron horseshoes above the door, believing cold iron repelled evil spirits. They would scatter salt across the threshold or place a knife beneath the mattress to cut the invisible tethers of witchcraft. The act of going to sleep required a litany of protective prayers, crossing oneself, and perhaps tying a pouch of pungent herbs like garlic or mugwort to the bedpost. The psychological weight of the night was immense. You were not just resting, you were navigating a spiritual battlefield, praying you would survive the dark to see the dawn. But the true conqueror of the night would not be a priest or an exorcist, it would be the engineer. The death knell for the ancient natural sleep cycle began to toll in the late 18th century, not with a demonic whisper, but with the deafening roar of the steam engine. The Industrial Revolution was upon us, and it brought with it a fundamental, ruthless redefinition of time. For millions of years, time had been circular, dictated by the spinning of the earth and the sweeping arc of the sun. But in the booming, soot-choked factory towns of Manchester, Birmingham, and Lowell, time became linear. It became measurable. It became money. The great textile mills and steel foundries were vast investments of capital, and an idle machine was a loss of profit. Therefore, the machines had to run constantly, day and night. And if the machines ran, the humans had to run with them. The ancient authority of the sun was brutally usurped by the authority of the factory bell and the punch clock. Work was no longer dictated by daylight, it was dictated by the shift. For the first time in human history, vast populations were forced to systematically ignore their circadian rhythms. Men, women, and children trudged into the factories before dawn, laboring under the harsh, hissing glare of indoor gas lamps, and returned to their crowded tenement beds long after dark. Sleep was abruptly demoted. It was no longer a sacred communal necessity or a time of quiet reflection. In the eyes of the industrialists, sleep was an irritating biological flaw, a necessary evil, a period of unproductivity that needed to be minimized at all costs. The biphasic sleep pattern, the gentle first sleep, the waking hour of intimacy, the restorative second sleep, was violently compressed. The working class was forced into a single, exhausted block of unconsciousness, squeezing whatever rest they could into the few hours between grueling shifts. The concept of sleeping in became a sign of moral failing, of laziness. The modern anxiety surrounding sleep, the guilt we feel when we aren't being productive, the obsession with getting exactly 8 unbroken hours, was born in the smoke and clamour of the industrial age. Then, in the late 19th century, the final, fatal blow was struck against the primordial dark. The invention and mass commercialization of the incandescent electric light bulb by figures like Thomas Edison completely severed our tether to the natural world. Electricity did not just illuminate the night, it annihilated it. With a simple flick of a switch, the interior of a home could be flooded with artificial daylight at midnight. We pushed the darkness back out of our homes, out of our streets, out of our cities. The night sky, which had guided human navigation and storytelling since the days of the savannah, was washed out by the orange haze of urban light pollution. The Milky Way disappeared from the consciousness of the modern city dweller. As the 20th century dawned, the architecture of sleep underwent its final transformation into the isolated, hyper-individualized spaces we know today. The sprawling families of the past who had huddled together for warmth and security in a single room were separated. The post-war economic boom in the mid-20th century brought the rise of the modern suburb, and with it the cultural expectation of the private bedroom. A house was no longer a single communal space, it was a honeycomb of isolated cells. Parents slept in the master bedroom, while children were placed in their own separate rooms down the hall, conditioned from infancy to sleep alone in the dark. We had finally achieved the ultimate evolutionary victory over the night. We slept in solid, predator-proof boxes, insulated by fiberglass and drywall. We controlled the ambient temperature with the push of a thermostat, rendering the freezing cave nights and the sweltering Egyptian summers obsolete. We slept on mattresses of memory foam and individually wrapped coils, covered in hypoallergenic synthetic sheets, completely removed from the crushed grass and animal hides of our ancestors. We had engineered the safest, most physically comfortable sleeping environment in the history of the planet. And yet a profound, undeniable irony has emerged in the modern era. Despite possessing the safest beds and the most secure homes humanity has ever known, we are suffering from an unprecedented epidemic of insomnia and sleep deprivation. We lie awake in our perfectly climate-controlled, solitary rooms, staring at the ceiling, our minds racing, unable to slip into the unconsciousness that came so naturally to our ancestors. Why? Because we have built a modern world that is completely at odds with our ancient biology. Our brains are still the brains of the Pleistocene hunter-gatherer. Deep within the center of our skulls, the pineal gland still waits for the sun to go down to release melatonin. But the sun never truly sets in the modern world. We spend our evenings staring into the relentless glare of glowing rectangles, our televisions, our laptops, our smartphones. These devices emit a harsh blue wavelength light that perfectly mimics the light of the midday sun. When we scroll through our phones in bed, we are beaming a signal directly into our retinas that tells our ancient brain, "Wake up, it is noon, danger is present, be alert." We are chemically suppressing our own ability to sleep. Furthermore, we have stripped away the deeply ingrained physiological triggers of rest. The temperature drop that accompanied the sunset on the savannah, which signaled the body to cool down for sleep, is masked by central heating. The profound, soothing comfort of the puppy pile, the release of oxytocin that came from sleeping in a dense, breathing community, has been replaced by the psychological isolation of the private bedroom. We sleep alone, disconnected from the reassuring heartbeat of the tribe, leaving our nervous systems in a constant, subtle state of hypervigilance. Our inner sentinel is still awake, waiting for the howl of the wolf, but hearing only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant siren of a police car. To understand the history of sleep is to realize that we are currently living in a radical, untested biological experiment. We have violently divorced ourselves from the natural rhythms of the planet that shaped our evolution for millions of years, but the ancient programming remains. The echoes of the campfire, the rustle of the dry grass mattress, the comfort of the shared breath in the dark. These memories are still written into the very fabric of our DNA. As we reach the end of this journey through time, from the swaying canopies of the prehistoric forest to the glowing screens of the modern bedroom, perhaps the greatest lesson we can learn from our ancestors is the need to reclaim the night. We cannot, and would not want to, return to the harsh realities of sleeping on the dirt, ever watchful for predators. But we can remember the wisdom of the dark. We can learn to dim the lights as the evening approaches, allowing our bodies to remember the sunset. We can lower the temperature of our bedrooms, inviting the cool chill of the ancient night. We can put away the glowing screens that trick our minds into endless daylight and instead return to the quiet, low-stakes activities of the evening. Reading a book by a soft lamp, having a quiet conversation, allowing the mind to wander and decompress before demanding unconsciousness. We can remember that sleep is not a machine to be optimized, nor a waste of productive time, but a profound biological sanctuary. So, tonight, as you lie in the quiet comfort of your bed, take a moment to feel the soft woven fabrics against your skin. Listen to the steady, rhythmic sound of your own breathing in the quiet room. Close your eyes and let the artificial world fade away. Allow your mind to drift back across the vast oceans of time. Imagine the warm, flickering glow of the first fire pushing back the shadows of the savannah. Feel the deep ancestral safety of the tribe surrounding you, keeping watch so that you may rest. The night is no longer a thing to be conquered or feared. It is a returning. It is the time when we surrender to the oldest rhythm of the earth. The day is done. The fire is safely banked. You are safe. It is time, at long last, to sleep.